entire medieval villages vanished so completely that historians still can't say exactly where they stood. Every winter, somewhere in the world, a river forgets its banks. Water climbs into streets that have never known it, into houses built by people who were certain the ground beneath them was solid, permanent, safe. But 700 years ago, in a village whose name barely survives, the water didn't just visit, it stayed. Fields vanished beneath silt. Walls dissolved into the current, and when the water finally pulled back weeks later, there was nothing left to rebuild. Archaeologists are still searching for exactly where that village stood, and yet the people who lived there, and thousands like them across medieval Europe, had already built one of the most sophisticated disaster response systems the world had seen. Some of it still exists today, buried in law, in landscape, in institutions older than the countries that now surround them. To understand how, we need to ask a question almost nobody thinks to ask. When the water came, who was actually in charge? Picture the Low Countries in the 14th century, a landscape barely above sea level, stitched together by earthen dikes that a strong autumn storm could turn to soup within hours. Villages here weren't just near water, they were built in defiance of it. On marshland the sea still considered its own. The St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421 reportedly destroyed dozens of settlements across Zeeland and South Holland, and some accounts describe the water advancing faster than a person could run. For families in these low-lying communities, flooding wasn't a distant weather event. It was the basic condition of existence, one that shaped how homes were built, how land was owned, and how neighbors depended on each other simply to stay alive. So how did anyone survive something that could arrive with almost no warning? The answer starts, oddly, not with panic, but with paperwork. Long before a single drop of water rose, these communities had already built an administrative machine dedicated to holding it back. In the Low Countries, it was called the water shap, a water board, among the oldest continuously functioning civic institutions in Europe. Every spring, landowners walked the length of their assigned dike, checking for cracks, soft spots, burrowing animals. One neglected stretch could drown an entire valley of neighbors. So neglect wasn't treated as bad luck, it was treated as a crime. Dutch water board records describe fines, forced labor, even seized property for those who let their section fail. This is where the first real surprise appears. We tend to picture medieval villagers as passive, waiting helplessly for disaster to strike. But in flood-prone regions, they behaved more like engineers, locked in a constant negotiation with a landscape that never stopped shifting, and it went further than dikes. In parts of the Low Countries and along the English coast, some villages were deliberately built on artificial mounds of raised earth, known in Frisian regions as turpen, entire settlements elevated by hand, sometimes over generations, specifically so ordinary flooding would pass harmlessly beneath them. Long before modern engineering, people were quite literally building their homes above the danger. Some households went further still, shaping their homes around the threat itself. In flood-prone regions, valuables and stored grain were often kept on upper floors rather than at ground level, and outbuildings were positioned with drainage and runoff in mind. Small, practical adjustments that turned an ordinary house into a slightly more forgiving one. And in some surviving churches across flood-prone Europe, faint marks etched into stone walls still record the height floodwaters once reached, a kind of memory carved directly into the building, though not every mark that survives traces back to the medieval period itself. Some were added generations later, onto buildings that had already stood through centuries of water, but preparation could only carry a village so far. Church bells were the emergency alert system of their day, rung in specific patterns to signal rising water, a rhythm distinct from the one used for fire, and distinct again from the one used for invasion. Imagine standing in a dark house as that pattern begins, recognizing instantly, without needing to be told, that somewhere beyond the fields, a dike has failed. Church towers, the tallest and sturdiest buildings most villages possessed, became the destination. Some churches were deliberately sited on the highest available ground for exactly this reason. Sanctuaries in more than one sense, doubling as civil defense infrastructure, and the relationship with the dike itself wasn't purely defensive. In the centuries that followed, the same low-lying geography that made flooding so dangerous would be turned into a weapon, the Dutch deliberately breaching their own defenses to flood the land ahead of an advancing army, a tactic that only worked because generations of medieval engineering had already taught people exactly how water moved across this landscape. The knowledge came first, the weapon came later. The human cost, though, could still be devastating, and here the story deepens. The St. Marcellus flood of 1362 struck the North Sea coast with such force that some estimates place the death toll in the tens of thousands, and it permanently redrew the coastline of what is now northern Germany and Denmark. Entire villages weren't merely damaged. Some were erased so completely that their remains are still being located beneath modern coastal sediment. This is the twist that reframes everything that came before. Medieval flood defense wasn't really about surviving one bad night. It was about surviving in a landscape that occasionally decided to become permanently different, and understanding that sometimes no amount of preparation would be enough. Picture a farmer standing at the edge of what had been his field the previous morning, now open water stretching to the horizon, his entire harvest gone in a single tide. Multiply that loss across 100 households, and you begin to understand why recovery required something beyond individual grit. Rebuilding demanded collective labor few families could manage alone. Clearing silt, repairing breached dikes, replanting drowned soil. Manorial and monastic records occasionally describe lords forgiving rents after major floods, not from generosity, but because a starving, displaced tenant produced nothing at all. Disaster, in other words, quietly renegotiated the relationship between peasant and lord, almost as thoroughly as it reshaped the land itself. Naturally, legend grew around these catastrophes too. Stories spread of church bells still tolling beneath drowned water, of entire kingdoms swallowed whole in a single night. Historians generally treat these as folklore rather than fact, a community's way of processing a trauma too large for ordinary memory to hold. But the myths deserve respect rather than dismissal, because they reveal something true. For people who had just watched their world dissolve, a story rooted in fate or divine judgment may have felt easier to carry than the truth that nature had simply indifferently won. What emerges from all of this isn't a story of medieval helplessness. It's an extraordinarily early form of collective risk management, built not on advanced technology, but on obligation, cooperation, and an intimate, inherited knowledge of how water behaved. Remarkably, many of the water boards established during this period still function today in some form, making them among the oldest continuously operating democratic institutions on Earth, older than most of the nations that now surround them. The greatest flood defense medieval Europe ever built wasn't a wall of stone or earth. It was a community that understood, generation after generation, that the river would always come back, and prepared for it anyway, not once, but forever.